Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the sequel to a game I just recently covered, namely the review copy of Studio Devexpresso's stealthy horror hybrid, the Coma 2 Vicious Sisters. Find out if I thought this was a successful sibling to the original title, or if this sequel should have suffered sororicide. Narratively speaking, the Coma 2 is a direct sequel to its predecessor, continuing the story shortly after the ending of the Coma recut. Unfortunately, this bodes poorly for our former protagonist, Young-Ho Choi, given the fact that he succumbed to the namesake illness of this game under mysterious circumstances. His only chance for salvation comes in the form of his childhood friend, Mina Park, who has found herself mired within the same dark world that had claimed him. Still, before she can even hope to unravel the secrets of the shadowy hellscape of the Coma, she'll need to stay alive, despite her every step being haunted by a murderous supernatural stalker. Which, yeah, introduction aside, I actually really enjoyed the way the narrative plays out in this chapter of the franchise. For one thing, Vicious Sisters does a great job of addressing all those unanswered questions left over from the first game, and then using them to both flesh out the backstory as well as drive the plot forward. What's more, while there is still an abundance of optional lore to acquire through the collectible notes, it didn't fall into the same pitfall as its predecessor, as I never found myself yelling at the protagonist to get a goddamn clue and check the notes they were holding on to for an obvious answer, or a warning that their choice of company was evil as fuck. What's more, I thoroughly appreciated that acquiring the true ending wasn't quite as obtuse, given I managed to snag it on my first run through of the game. Partly because I went over everything with a fine-tooth comb for loot, but also due to the abundance of narrative cues it provided in cutscenes and notes which served as hints. Still, I was left wondering if there was another game due for this franchise, at least for the world it established over the course of my conjoined win over the Coma games, both due to a few story elements that crop up late game, as well as a number of the ending beats. Curiosity aside, though, let's move on to something a bit more concrete, and talk shop about Vicious Sisters' mechanics. For those familiar with the Coma recut, either from playing it or due to my last review, it should be fairly easy to pick up and play, as the basic premise remains the same. Essentially, you're once more weaving through a hazardous environment, doing your best to salvage supplies, to survive the night, and to progress forward through the narrative. And just like its predecessor, you'll find your every step hounded by a tenacious and terrifying tenebrous tormentor, who's a teacher. That said, I still found that it managed to establish its own identity quite well, with notable changes being apparent even early on. One of the first that you encounter, in fact, is the adjustments made to stealth, as you'll find yourself no longer able to crouch down and hide in place. Instead, the game expands the amount of objects that you can use as shelter, albeit with a different sort of cost. See, whenever your stalker's nearby, you'll find yourself faced with a brief QTE, the complexity of which is directly tied to how efficient your hiding place is. If you're cozily hanging out in a cabinet, you might only have a single button to press, whereas if you're crammed yourself under a counter, you might have a slew of inputs to deal with, which can be further compounded if you dash into a hiding spot while out of breath. Whilst I normally abhor QTEs, I will say I don't overly mind them here, since they serve the distinct purpose of forcing me to pay attention and watching my stalker draw close. Plus, the few times where I botched them and wound up lurching out from my hiding spot resulted in some of the most impromptu and frantic chase scenes during the entirety of my playthrough. Made all the more tense when I realized another changes from its predecessor, namely the sheer degree they increased Darksong's deadliness, and not because of anything I would denigrate as cheesy either, given I found her general AI and patrol patterns to be a lot more fair in Vicious Sisters. Read, she doesn't just teleport in front of you when you get a big enough lead on her anymore. No, what makes Darksong an absolutely anxiety-inducing antagonist is the fact that she eschews any illusion of civility when she catches Mina, and just skips to straight out tearing her fucking heart out of her chest. Just fucking dead. Unless you're carrying around pepper spray. Pepper spray serves as a one-shot consumable you can find or purchase, which occupies its own unique inventory space. For as you're carrying one around when Song catches you, you'll be given a bogglingly easy QTE, which not only frees you from her grasp if you succeed, but also stuns her for a few moments so you can beat a retreat. What's more, even without the spray, I still felt that I had more viable options in surviving Song's slaughter sprees. Because Vicious Sisters also improved how dodging worked, since Mina's evasion animations have a lot of iframes, which makes them a lot friendlier, plus they also allow you to travel a fair distance, which facilitates weaving around hazards and homicidal loons alike. And yes, plural, given the sequel not only expands upon the overall size and scale by allowing you to visit locales other than the school, it also implements additional adversaries to avoid. Some of these are simple enough in their design, boiling down to mere moving obstacles, which haunt a given location. Yet there's also more unique ones to be found, who harry and hunt Mina in a similar fashion to Dark Song. Whilst these phantasmal killers aren't quite as efficient at instantaneously eviscerating our hero, their grim tenacity still serves to keep players on their toes and potentially drain their exceedingly limited inventory of healing items. In and of itself, it makes the choice of whether or not you want to stay in an area and poke around for optional content like the lore notes, fast travel points, and the items needed for the true ending, and even spare supplies, a meaningful decision. That said, the existence of the optional objectives only serves to compound the tactical significance of this choice. Essentially, these objectives can be described as scavenger hunts, so you're tasked with seeking out materials and then crafting an object, complete with a QTE I do find completely unnecessary. What makes these important, however, is that they effectively provide you with a key item necessary to deal with Dark Song when you encounter her at certain key moments of the game. Whilst you can avoid collecting them in order to progress forward faster, if you don't have this item, you'll lose max health permanently. And given there's 4 such climactic encounters, you can actually wind up with Mina being so fragile she's apt to keel over from being sneezed on. I actually did my second playthrough like this, and let me tell you, while it's not so bad if you only skip 1 or 2, skipping all of them makes the game a fair bit more challenging, and significantly changes the value of items within your loadout, since you can't actually heal anymore, since you're always at max health. It's also where I found out just how powerful the ghost match items were, as not only were they useful for opening up certain supply items, they also disintegrate the lesser ghosts roaming the halls, which can be a lifesaver. Oh, and speaking of lifesavers, I know I griped a fair bit about this in the Coma recut, but this game actually does pause when you check the map, your notes, your inventory now, so you're actually able to do things like reorient yourself and strategize an escape route on the fly. It's such a small, basic detail, but no, I'm just happy about this. This is just good. And it's not just the gameplay that's seen improvements here, as it also represents a step up visually from its sibling. There's a lot more variety in the environments and the obstacles now, providing some lovely graphics to ogle as you progress forward through the Coma's dark world, including some nice bits of environmental storytelling you'll come across over the course of your journey. Like, some pretty damn neat scenes, especially late game. The cutscenes were also just really fun to see. The fact that their outcomes changed based on whether or not you did an area subquest felt intensely rewarding. But the element I found incredibly impressive was just the decision to actually change the player model in the various portraits if you failed to do the optional objectives and accrued injuries. It was a really neat detail in a similarly morbid vein as the different game over screens, which are triggered based on where you croak. The visuals weren't the only improvement either. First off, while it's not in English, save for some lines from an English teacher, there is voice acting to accompany chunks of the game, which is a pretty neat detail. That said, it was the music and sound design at large that really sold me. There's just some great ambience to be found, whether it was due to the musical accompaniment to some scenes or a very creepy walk down a long subway tunnel.
Fire in the train.
And yes, as ever, heel clicks still serve as the harrowing harbinger of your stalker, helping to ramp up the old stress into cardiac arrest levels. So, there's that. Plus, if you're an audiophile, the ending themes are pretty neat, though I wasn't quite expecting to have the good one break out into K-pop. Anyways, that brings us to the conclusion, and if that isn't abundantly clear by this point, I enjoyed this title a lot more than I expected, given my experience with its predecessor. Mechanically, I found myself surprised by just how many quality of life changes there were and just how much smoother it played. And I can't count the number of times I found myself relieved at the changes to both the stealth mechanics as well as Dark Song's behavior. There's also a few more puzzles to indulge in this time around, which helped to add a few more novel experiences to the game at large. And narratively, I just really dug the way the story progressed and appreciated the abundance of lore to be discovered. It actually led to me appreciating the first game more, at least on a storytelling front, and to incite a bit more curiosity as to whether or not there was more to come from this world. Enough so that I actually played through the game a second time just to see some of the mechanical differences in the bad ending. Really, all of that, I'd say, is enough that I'd entirely warrant this title as a hit. And I'd recommend it for the legitimate bits of suspense it builds up as well as its stealth components. That said, P.S. Dear Devexpresso, fuck your jump scare monster. But thanks again for the review copy of the game. Anywho, to all you folks still tuned in, thanks for watching. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you're interested in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks. Fuck you, jump scare monster.